4,000 years ago, a city watched the sky turn the wrong color at noon, and its people understood that history was breaking. Clay tablets later whispered of fire, famine, and gods who no longer answered. Why did the world's first civilization believe its end was written into the heavens? Why do official timelines soften the violence into neat transitions? Why were cries of grief pressed into wet clay as if someone feared memory itself would be erased? Why do the ruins speak more clearly than the summaries in textbooks? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The city did not fall in silence. Long before walls cracked and gates burned, sound itself became a warning. Bells rang for ration distributions that no longer satisfied hunger. Temple courtyards echoed with arguments instead of hymns. In the streets, animals cried because their fodder had been cut, and people listened to those cries with a recognition that felt uncomfortably human. Clay tablets from this period record numbers first, because numbers were how catastrophe announced itself. A jar of barley that once cost a single measure of silver suddenly required 10, then 30, then 60. These figures were not abstract economics, but daily terror, written by scribes whose hands shook as they pressed reeds into clay. The tablets speak of Ur, of Nippur, of Uruk, names that once meant order and divine protection. Each city was believed to belong to a god, not metaphorically, but literally, as if the streets were part of a divine estate and the people its tenants. When the texts say a god abandoned a city, the image was not symbolic. It meant the god statue was removed from its temple or left uncared for, rituals interrupted, food offerings spoiled. A city without its god was like a body without breath, still standing but already dead. The laments describe this moment with unsettling clarity, as if the writers were trying to freeze the instant when faith failed before stone did. Archaeologists uncovered these tablets buried beneath ash and collapsed roofs, especially in Nippur, the sacred heart of Sumer, where Enlil, chief among the gods, was believed to rule the fates of cities like a judge presiding over a cosmic court. The fire that destroyed the temple library hardened the clay, preserving words that were never meant to last. They were emergency records, grief pressed into matter, composed not for posterity but for survival. Yet survival did not come. The laments describe skies thick with dust, so dense that midday resembled twilight, not as poetry, but as observation. Modern readers might imagine a massive firestorm or the choking haze of burning reeds and bitumen, the natural asphalt used in Mesopotamian construction, turning daylight into something sickly and dim. The collapse was not a single blow, but a convergence. Military defeat was only the final sound in a long sequence of fractures. Administrative tablets reveal a state stretched thin, its intricate bureaucracy still functioning on paper, while reality unraveled beneath it. Letters between officials speak of caravans that never arrived, of messengers who vanished on roads that had become lethal corridors. These were not roads in the modern sense, but packed earth routes between canals and fields, once guarded and predictable, now stalked by raiders moving faster than authority could respond. The enemies named in the texts came from the east, from Elam, a region beyond the Tigris where mountains rose and the land was unfamiliar to Sumerian eyes. To a Sumerian scribe, Elam was both a real political threat and a symbolic direction, the place from which chaos arrived. The laments describe soldiers who showed no mercy, who cut down orchards and smashed shrines, actions that mattered as much spiritually as materially. Destroying a sacred grove was an attack on a god's presence, like burning a flag and a cathedral at once. Warfare here was not just about territory, but about severing the bond between people and the divine. Yet even as armies advanced, the land itself was betraying its caretakers. Southern Mesopotamia depended entirely on irrigation, canals carved and maintained by collective labor. Over centuries, water drawn from the rivers evaporated under the brutal sun, leaving salts behind in the soil. At first, the damage was subtle. Wheat yields declined, so farmers shifted to barley, a hardier grain that could tolerate salt but offered less nourishment. This change is visible in the tablets, in lists of crops that quietly alter over time, like a medical chart recording a patient's slow decline. Fields eventually became white-crusted and barren, described as dead land in administrative records that no longer hid the truth. Climate compounded the problem. Geological evidence points to a prolonged drought around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, part of a wider aridification that affected lands from the eastern Mediterranean to the Iranian plateau. Rivers ran lower, rains failed in the north, and the irrigation systems of the south struggled to compensate. Famine followed, and famine eroded loyalty faster than any invading army. Hungry officials defected. Provincial governors withheld grain. The center could no longer enforce its will, and the phrase, "the center cannot hold," though modern, feels eerily accurate when reading these ancient accounts. The laments capture this unraveling not as analysis, but as lived horror. Mothers are described searching for food that does not exist, temples standing silent because priests have fled or starved, cattle pens burning because no one remains to put out the fire. The Euphrates is said to run red, an image that conjures both blood and the silt stirred up by violence. These descriptions are specific enough to feel witnessed, not imagined. The writers were not distant chroniclers but survivors, or the immediate heirs of survivors, trying to make sense of a world that had turned hostile to its own creators. What makes these texts extraordinary is their emotional honesty. Ancient histories often celebrate kings and victories, but these tablets mourn failure. They accuse the gods, even as they beg them. They record confusion, disbelief, and a sense that something fundamental had gone wrong in the relationship between humans, land, and heaven. In one lament, the destruction is described as a storm that did not pass, a disaster without the usual rhythm of recovery. Storms were familiar in Mesopotamia, violent but temporary. This one lingered, poisoned fields, scattered people, and refused to end. The destruction of Ur in 2004 BCE stands as a grim punctuation mark in this process. The city, once radiant with temples and wealth, was sacked, its last king captured and taken away, never to return. The tablets do not celebrate this conquest. They recoil from it. Ur's fall was not portrayed as the rise of a new order, but as the extinguishing of light. In the Sumerian worldview, cities were the anchors of civilization itself. To lose them was to risk sliding back into a world without writing, law, or memory. Yet memory survived, paradoxically, because of the very violence that erased the cities. Fire baked the tablets, collapse buried them. Centuries later, when archaeologists brushed sand from their surfaces, they uncovered not just data, but voices. Voices that speak of a civilization aware of its own ending, documenting it with a clarity that feels almost defiant. These were not myths written long after the fact. They were contemporaneous records, the closest thing to an ancient disaster archive. Reading them today forces an uncomfortable recognition. The Sumerians were not ignorant of their predicament. They saw the signs, measured the losses, and named the failures. Their tragedy was not blindness, but entrapment in systems they could not quickly undo. An economy dependent on fragile land, a political structure too rigid to adapt, a theology that struggled to explain prolonged suffering. The end of Sumer was not sudden. It was slow, documented line by line, tablet by tablet, until the writing stopped, because the writers themselves were gone. In the ruins of those cities, beneath layers of ash and time, the tablets remain as evidence that the first great civilization understood its own collapse with painful clarity. They did not vanish quietly into legend. They recorded their fall, believing that if the gods would not listen, perhaps the clay would remember. Before collapse became visible as ruin, it existed as routine. The machinery of the state continued to turn even as its bearings wore down, and nowhere is this clearer than in the administrative tablets that survived from the final generations of Sumerian power. These texts are often dismissed as dry lists, but within them lies a quiet narrative of strain. Ration allocations shrink by fractions that matter deeply when multiplied across tens of thousands of mouths. Work rosters lengthen, demanding labor from people already weakened by hunger. Orders are repeated, then repeated again, as if authority itself were growing hoarse. The Sumerian state was built on control through counting. Grain, sheep, labor days, bricks, boats, all were measured and recorded with obsessive precision. A scribe's education trained him to see the world as a grid of quantities, each one owed to someone else. This system had created the world's first cities, but it also bound them into rigid patterns. When the land failed, the bureaucracy could only respond by demanding more from less. Tablets show entire provinces assigned impossible quotas, expected to deliver grain that no longer grew in their fields. The language of obligation remains unchanged, even as reality dissolves beneath it. At the heart of this system stood the temple and the palace, twin pillars of authority that were often physically intertwined. The temple was not merely a place of worship, but an economic engine, managing land, labor, and storage. The palace mirrored this structure, focusing on military and political power. In better times, these institutions balanced one another, with priests interpreting divine will and kings enforcing it. In crisis, they competed for shrinking resources. Letters hint at disputes over who had the right to collect grain, who controlled storehouses, who could command labor for repairs that never quite finished. The gods themselves became entangled in this struggle. Sumerian religion was intensely practical. Gods controlled floods, fertility, health, and war, and their favor was maintained through constant ritual care. When resources dwindled, rituals suffered, offerings were reduced, festivals were delayed or canceled. The laments describe gods turning their faces away, an image that suggests neglect as much as wrath. A god ignored was a god who might leave. and divine departure meant political doom. Faith here was not abstract belief, but a fragile contract maintained through material exchange. As external threats mounted, internal cohesion weakened. Provinces began to act like separate states, hoarding grain, negotiating with enemies, or declaring independence outright. Tablets record officials begging the king for help that never arrives, messages that read like prayers sent to a silent sky. The language grows desperate, stripped of formal courtesy. Where earlier correspondence followed strict conventions, later letters cut directly to crisis, listing raids, starvation, and fear in blunt terms. Military organization also faltered under these pressures. The Sumerian army relied on both professional soldiers and seasonal levies drawn from the farming population. Famine undermined both. Hungry farmers could not leave their fields, such as they were, and hungry soldiers could not fight effectively. Weapons appear in inventories without matching lists of trained men to use them. Garrisons report shortages of food and supplies, an ominous sign in a system where the army's loyalty depended on regular rations. Environmental damage compounded these human failures. Salinization, the slow poisoning of the soil through irrigation, had reached critical levels in many regions. Administrative records note fields abandoned, canals clogged, and labor reassigned from cultivation to maintenance that could no longer restore fertility. The land that had once been described as lush and overflowing is now labeled bitter. This bitterness was not poetic exaggeration, but literal taste, as salt crystals formed on the surface of the earth, visible and irreversible with the tools available at the time. Climate stress intensified this decline. Drought reduced river flow, disrupting irrigation schedules calibrated over generations. Northern regions dependent on rainfall suffered first, sending waves of displaced people southward into already strained cities. These migrants appear in the tablets as additional mouths to feed, additional laborers to control, additional sources of unrest. The social fabric stretched thin, and trust eroded between classes, between city and countryside, between ruler and ruled. Violence, once structured and ritualized through warfare between city-states, became more chaotic. Raids replaced campaigns. Banditry flourished along trade routes that had once carried goods and ideas across vast distances. Merchants vanished from records, a silence more telling than any lament. Without trade, cities lost access to materials they could not produce themselves, further weakening their ability to repair infrastructure or equip armies. Isolation bred vulnerability. In this atmosphere, the laments take on their full weight. They are not abstract theology, but attempts to impose meaning on cascading failure. By framing destruction as divine decision, the texts offered a narrative that preserved moral order even as physical order collapsed. If the gods had decreed this end, then suffering was not random. It had purpose, however cruel. This interpretation allowed survivors to mourn without abandoning their worldview, even as that worldview had failed to protect them. Yet cracks appear even in this explanation. Some passages accuse specific gods of negligence or betrayal, a startling move in a culture built on reverence. The writers oscillate between submission and protest, reflecting a society unsure whether obedience or outrage is the appropriate response to annihilation. This tension gives the texts their haunting power. They are not confident sermons, but arguments written in grief. The fall of Sumer was not the disappearance of people overnight. life continued in reduced, altered forms. Villages persisted where cities fell. Languages shifted. Power migrated northward and westward. But the urban experiment that had defined Sumer, dense cities sustained by fragile ecological balance and immense administrative control, had reached its limits. The Laments mark the moment when that realization crystallized, when the future narrowed to survival rather than expansion. What remains extraordinary is that the Sumerians chose to record this moment so carefully. In a culture that prized order, they documented disorder. In a system built on optimism about human management of nature and gods, they preserved evidence of failure. The tablets are not just remnants of a lost civilization, but warnings encoded in clay. They show how complexity, once a source of strength, can become a liability when flexibility disappears. The end of Sumer was not the end of civilization, but it was the end of a particular way of imagining permanence. Cities had been thought eternal, gods reliable, systems self-correcting. The Laments reveal the shock of discovering otherwise. They are the sound of certainty breaking, captured by scribes who understood that something unprecedented had happened, something that could not be undone by rebuilding a wall or appeasing a god with extra offerings. In the silence after the tablets stop, there is no clear resolution, only absence. That absence speaks as loudly as the words that precede it. Sumer's collapse was not a mythic flood that reset the world, but a slow unmaking that left survivors staring at familiar landscapes, rendered unrecognizable. The clay remembers this unmaking in detail, reminding anyone who reads it that even the first civilization learned too late how fragile its foundations truly were. To understand what was lost, the mind must travel backward to a time before the Laments, before hunger rewrote daily life, when the land between the rivers felt like a promise rather than a trap. Southern Mesopotamia was harsh by nature, flat and blindingly bright, where summer heat pressed down like weight and rain was a rumor carried from distant mountains. Nothing grew there by accident. Every field existed because someone had cut a canal, leveled earth, and persuaded water to move against its own laziness. Civilization here was not a gift of nature, but an act of defiance against it. The earliest Sumerian settlements began as modest clusters of mud brick houses near waterways, places where extended families worked land together and shared the risk of flood or drought. Over generations, these villages thickened. Canals multiplied like veins across the plain, linking communities into networks that demanded coordination. Water had to arrive at the right moment, in the right amount, or the crop failed. Too much drowned the seedlings. Too little baked them into dust. Managing this balance required planning beyond any single household's reach. Out of this necessity emerged authority. Not at first as kings or conquerors, but as organizers. Someone had to decide whose field received water first, who would repair a breach, who would contribute labor when silt clogged a canal. These decisions carried weight because water was survival. Over time, those who managed water also managed people, and leadership hardened into hierarchy. The earliest power structures in Sumer were less about domination than coordination, though domination followed soon enough. As settlements grew into towns and towns into cities, architecture followed ambition. Mud brick walls thickened, not just to defend against enemies, but to hold back the rivers themselves. Temples rose at the center, first as simple platforms, later as towering stepped structures that lifted the god's house above the floodplain. These early ziggurats were not monuments to vanity, but declarations of order, stone and brick, arranged to assert that humans and gods together could tame chaos. The city of Uruk embodied this transformation. At its height, it covered an area unimaginable for its time, filled with tens of thousands of people who depended on systems older villages had never required. Streets twisted between dense housing blocks, leading toward temple precincts that dominated both skyline and economy. Here, labor was no longer seasonal and shared, but specialized. Some people farmed. Others brewed beer, wove wool, shaped metal, or kept accounts. Each role depended on the others, binding the population into an interlocking machine. Writing emerged as the lubricant of this machine. At first, it was nothing more than marks pressed into clay to track goods, jars of oil, baskets of grain, flocks of sheep. But these marks grew abstract, evolving into a system capable of capturing speech itself. This innovation did more than record transactions. It froze decisions in time, turning promises into obligations that could be enforced long after voices fell silent. Writing made authority durable, portable, and impersonal. Scribes became the keepers of this new power. Trained from childhood, they memorized hundreds of signs and their shifting meanings, learning to see language as something that could be dissected and reconstructed. Their tablets filled storerooms and archives, creating institutional memory that outlasted individual lives. Through writing, cities remembered who owed what, which gods had been honored, which kings had ruled. Memory became infrastructure. Religion wove itself seamlessly into this system. Each city belonged to a specific deity whose favor guaranteed prosperity. The temple was the god's household, and its priests acted as estate managers, overseeing land, labor, and storage. Offerings flowed in, rations flowed out, and the god was kept satisfied through daily ritual. This was not blind faith, but mutual dependence. The god protected the city fed the god. Order rested on reciprocity. Trade extended this order outward. Sumer lacked stone, timber, and metals, so merchants traveled vast distances to obtain them, carrying grain and textiles in exchange. These journeys stitched Sumer into a wider world, connecting it to mountains, coasts, and foreign cultures. Exotic materials like lapis lazuli and cedar became symbols of reach and sophistication, proof that the city's influence extended beyond the horizon. Yet even in its prime, Sumer was never peaceful. City-states competed relentlessly over water, land, and prestige. Warfare was organized, ritualized, and frequent. Soldiers marched in tight formations behind shields, kings commemorated victories in stone, and defeat meant humiliation before the gods. Violence was not a breakdown of the system, but one of its tools, a way to reset boundaries and assert dominance. This constant conflict drove innovation, but also planted seeds of exhaustion. Walls had to be rebuilt, armies fed, fields reclaimed after destruction. The system worked as long as resources expanded, or at least held steady. When they did not, strain accumulated invisibly, like stress fractures in a monument that still appeared intact. The Sumerians believed their cities were eternal because they were divinely sanctioned. Floods came and went, enemies rose and fell, but the city remained, anchored by ritual, record, and repetition. This belief shaped their confidence and blinded them to slow threats. Soil salinization did not announce itself with armies. Drought did not negotiate. Administrative overreach did not feel dangerous while tablets were still being written and seals still rolled into clay. By the time the first laments were composed, the memory of this earlier confidence still lingered. The grief expressed in those texts gains its power from contrast. The writers remembered what had been built, how hard it had been to wrest order from mud and water. They knew the cost of cities because they inherited the labor of countless ancestors who had dug canals and raised walls under the same brutal sun. This is why the fall of Sumer felt like more than political defeat. It was the collapse of an argument humanity had been making against nature itself. The cities were proof that coordination, faith, and record-keeping could overcome environment. When they failed, the implication was devastating. If even the gods' own cities could be erased, what hope remained for smaller, less favored places? The laments echo with this realization. They do not merely mourn lost buildings or kings, but the shattering of an idea that civilization, once achieved, was secure. The past, they recall, is not romanticized simplicity, but disciplined complexity, a world held together by systems that demanded constant effort and belief. Losing that world meant losing a sense of inevitability about progress. Understanding Sumer at its height makes its end harder to dismiss as an ancient anomaly. The same forces that built it, organization, specialization, faith in systems, also made it vulnerable when conditions changed. The rise contained the shape of the fall, though no one could see it clearly at the time. The laments are powerful because they stand at the threshold between these two realizations, written by people who had inherited greatness and lived long enough to watch it dissolve. In their words, the past is not distant. It is immediate, tactile, as real as the clay they shaped. They remind us that the first civilization did not stumble into ruin unknowingly. It fell with full awareness of what had once been possible, and that knowledge made the loss unbearable. Power in Sumer never belonged solely to kings, because kings themselves were inventions layered atop older authorities. Long before crowns and conquest, the city had been governed by gods whose presence was assumed as surely as the river's course. Every administrative decision, every military campaign, every redistribution of grain existed within a sacred framework that made obedience feel natural. When this framework cracked, the damage went deeper than politics. It reached into how people understood causality itself. The Sumerian cosmos was crowded and intimate. Gods were not distant abstractions, but neighbors with appetites. They ate, drank, slept, and grew angry when neglected. Their statues were treated as living bodies, clothed in fine textiles, washed, perfumed, and fed daily. To fail in these duties was not metaphorical disrespect, but real neglect, like abandoning a dependent elder. The temple staff who performed these rituals were caretakers as much as priests, and their work tied religion directly to material abundance. Each city's patron god defined its identity. Ur belonged to Nana, the moon god whose cycles governed time and fertility. Nippur was Enlil's domain, the place where destiny itself was believed to be assigned. Uruk belonged to Inanna, fierce and contradictory, goddess of love and war. These divine patrons were rivals just as their cities were, and victories in war were interpreted as proof of divine superiority. When a city fell, it was not merely defeated. It was abandoned by its god or punished for some offense. This belief shaped how disaster was recorded. The laments do not blame poor planning or ecological exhaustion in explicit terms. Instead, they describe councils of gods debating destruction, as if catastrophe required celestial authorization. This imagery was not escapism, but a way to impose coherence on suffering. If the gods chose destruction, then destruction followed rules, even if those rules were inscrutable. Meaning survived where explanation failed. Yet beneath this theological language lies evidence of human struggle for legitimacy. Kings depended on divine favor to rule. Inscriptions emphasized how rulers were chosen by gods, loved by them, nurtured from infancy under divine protection. When the state faltered, these claims rang hollow. If a king truly enjoyed divine support, why did famine spread? Why did enemies breach walls? Why did temples burn? Some texts hint at a crisis of confidence. Gods are portrayed as weeping for their cities, as if regretful or powerless to intervene. This subtle shift matters. A god who weeps is no longer fully in control. The image suggests a world where divine order itself is destabilized, where even heaven reacts rather than commands. For a culture built on cosmic hierarchy, this was an unsettling thought. Kings attempted to respond by intensifying ritual. Offerings increased where possible. New hymns were composed. Temples were rebuilt even as surrounding neighborhoods decayed. These acts were not cynical displays, but desperate attempts to restore balance. Ritual was technology in Sumer, a means of influencing reality. When it failed, the failure was existential. Political authority suffered alongside religious doubt. The king was both military leader and chief steward of the gods' estates. His success depended on demonstrating order, full storehouses, obedient provinces, secure borders. As shortages mounted, his ability to project authority diminished. Letters from officials reveal hesitation, even defiance, toward royal commands that no longer aligned with survival. The sacred aura of kingship thinned under pressure. This erosion of legitimacy was exacerbated by succession crises. The Sumerian state depended heavily on personal authority, reinforced by lineage and divine sanction. When kings died or were captured, continuity faltered. Rival claimants emerged. Provinces tested independence. Without a strong center, the carefully balanced system of obligations unraveled quickly. Foreign enemies exploited this weakness, but they did not create it. Elamite forces and other groups attacked cities already strained, their success amplified by internal decay. The Laments' emphasis on enemy cruelty reflects real trauma, but it also masks a painful truth. The system had become unsustainable even without invasion. The gods' supposed decisions mirrored human failure more closely than the writers could admit outright. The emotional tone of the Laments reveals this tension. They oscillate between reverence and accusation, submission and protest. At times, the writers beg the gods to remember their cities, listing past devotion like a ledger of good deeds. At other moments, they seem to question the justice of destruction itself, asking why the innocent suffer alongside the guilty. This moral discomfort marks a significant moment in human thought, where divine authority is still accepted but no longer unquestioned. In this struggle to explain catastrophe, memory becomes selective. Earlier triumphs are recalled vividly, not to celebrate, but to contrast. The greater the former glory, the more unbearable its loss. The laments linger on images of bustling streets now silent, temples once alive with music now empty. These details are not decorative. They serve as evidence in an unspoken argument that the city did not deserve its fate. The god's silence becomes a central theme. In ritual life, silence was ominous. Omens were sought constantly, signs in the liver of a sacrificed animal, patterns in smoke, movements of stars. When signs failed to appear or contradicted expectations, anxiety spread. A silent god was worse than an angry one because anger implied engagement. Silence implied abandonment. This sense of abandonment reshaped how the Sumerians understood time. The future, once envisioned as continuity through repetition, became uncertain. Festivals tied to agricultural cycles lost meaning when crops failed. Calendars still turned, but the rhythm felt hollow. The laments freeze this moment, capturing a society aware that its inherited assumptions no longer functioned. What emerges from these texts is not simple piety, but a complex negotiation with belief. The Sumerians did not abandon their gods, but they reinterpreted them under pressure. Disaster forced theology to stretch, to accommodate suffering on an unprecedented scale. The result was not resolution, but expression, a body of literature that records emotional truth even when explanatory frameworks collapse. This is why the laments endure. They are not propaganda alone, nor are they mere religious exercises. They are documents of psychological survival, attempts to maintain identity when the structures that defined it disintegrated. Through them, we glimpse a civilization confronting the limits of its own worldview. The fall of Sumer was thus not only the end of cities, but a crisis of meaning. Authority, divine and human, failed simultaneously, leaving individuals to navigate loss with tools that no longer worked as intended. The clay tablets preserve this moment of disorientation, offering a rare view into how the first civilization struggled to understand its own undoing, not just materially, but spiritually and intellectually as well. When the cities finally fell silent, the land did not empty all at once. People remained, adapting to a world stripped of its former density and certainty. What vanished was not humanity, but the urban experiment that had defined Sumerian life for centuries. Streets that once echoed with trade and ritual became paths between scattered dwellings. Canals still carried water, but fewer hands were left to maintain them, and their reach shrank year by year. Civilization did not end, it thinned. Archaeological layers from this period reveal a contraction rather than annihilation. Grand buildings were abandoned, reused as quarries for brick, their carefully planned geometry broken into practical fragments. Houses clustered closer to surviving water sources, abandoning peripheral neighborhoods. Administrative tablets become rarer, not because writing disappeared, but because fewer transactions required recording. Simpler lives generated less paperwork. The silence in the archives mirrors the simplification of daily existence. Trade networks collapsed first. Without surplus grain or textiles, cities could no longer sustain long-distance exchange. Exotic materials disappear from the archaeological record, replaced by local substitutes of lesser quality. Lapis lazuli vanishes. Cedar wood becomes scarce. Metal tools grow cruder, repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. This material impoverishment reflects a deeper loss, connection to a wider world. Isolation returned, not as a choice, but as a condition imposed by scarcity and insecurity. Social structures adjusted accordingly. Large institutions like temples and palaces, once the engines of redistribution, lost their dominance. Without reliable inflows of goods, they could no longer support vast staffs. Priests and administrators became farmers again, or migrated elsewhere. Authority fragmented, returning power to households and local leaders. The centralized systems that had defined Sumer unraveled into smaller, more flexible units, better suited to survival under stress. Language itself shifted during this transition. Sumerian, already declining as a spoken tongue, retreated further into ritual and scholarship. Akkadian, spoken by populations long present in Mesopotamia, became dominant in daily life. This change is visible in tablets that mix languages or replace Sumerian terms with Akkadian ones, a linguistic adaptation mirroring social transformation. Cultural identity did not disappear. It blended, reshaping itself to fit new realities. Memory, however, remained stubborn. Even as cities declined, scribes continued to copy older texts, preserving hymns, myths, and king lists. This act of preservation was not nostalgia alone, but strategy. In a world of instability, memory offered continuity. Knowing who had ruled before, which gods had mattered, which laws once held force gave meaning to present hardship. The past became a resource, mined for legitimacy and instruction. This preservation was selective. Texts celebrating conquest and prosperity were copied alongside laments, creating a record that balanced pride with warning. The story of Gilgamesh, a king who sought immortality and failed, gained renewed relevance. His journey, ending in acceptance of human limits, resonated with societies that had seen their own claims to permanence collapse. Literature adapted to circumstance, emphasizing humility where confidence had once ruled. Political power during this interlude was unstable and local. Short-lived rulers appear in king lists with reigns measured in months rather than decades. These lists compress chaos into order by naming succession even where control was tenuous. Writing the names mattered more than their accuracy. It asserted that kingship, as an institution, persisted even when individual kings failed. Environmental stress continued to shape outcomes. Fields abandoned due to salinization did not recover quickly. In some areas, they never recovered at all, returning to marsh or desert. Populations migrated northward where rainfall was more reliable, leaving southern regions increasingly depopulated. The heartland of Sumer shifted, its former core becoming a marginal zone. Out of this fragmentation emerged new powers. Amorite groups from the west, once peripheral pastoralists, settled into abandoned cities, adopting Mesopotamian culture while reshaping it. Elam remained a persistent presence to the east. The vacuum left by Sumer invited competition, experimentation, and eventual consolidation under new political forms. Collapse created opportunity, though at immense human cost. What survived from Sumer was not its political structure, but its intellectual legacy. Writing endured. Legal concepts persisted. Mathematical systems remained in use. The idea that the world could be organized, measured, and recorded did not die with the cities that first practiced it. Instead, it traveled, carried by scribes and traditions into new states that learned from Sumer's achievements and failures alike. The laments themselves played a role in this transmission. By recording catastrophe, they offered future generations a cautionary memory. They demonstrated that cities could fall, gods could abandon, and systems could break. This knowledge tempered later ambitions, even as it inspired attempts to rebuild. Memory became both burden and guide. In the centuries that followed, Mesopotamia would rise again under new dynasties, some claiming Sumerian heritage explicitly, others absorbing it quietly. They rebuilt temples, restored canals, and revived bureaucracy, but never quite with the same innocence. The shadow of collapse lingered, shaping policy and belief. Kings boasted of restoring order not as novelty, but as recovery from remembered chaos. The end of Sumer thus marked a transition rather than an erasure. It closed a chapter defined by unprecedented experimentation in urban life, and opened another shaped by adaptation and synthesis. The first civilization did not simply vanish, it dissolved into the foundations of those that followed. Its cities fell, but its ideas endured, embedded in clay, language, and memory. The tablets left behind do not beg for pity. They insist on recognition. They show that complexity brings vulnerability, that success carries hidden costs, and that memory is often preserved by disaster itself. In reading them, one does not merely study the past, but confront a mirror, reflecting patterns that repeat whenever societies mistake durability for permanence. Out of fragmentation came reassembly, not as a return to what had been lost, but as something sharper and more controlled. In the decades after Sumer's collapse, Mesopotamia did not drift indefinitely in disarray. Power began to concentrate again, guided by leaders who had studied failure closely, even if only through inherited memory. The landscape still bore scars of abandoned canals and ruined temples, yet within those ruins lay a blueprint for renewal. What followed was not resurrection, but reinvention. The revival took shape in the south, where remnants of Sumerian culture persisted most strongly. Here, kings learned to rule not only through divine favor and military force, but through administration refined to an unprecedented degree. The state that emerged was obsessive in its record-keeping, as if determined to never again be surprised by scarcity or rebellion. Tens of thousands of tablets from this era survive, documenting movements of sheep, deliveries of grain, rotations of labor, and the smallest losses, all tracked with relentless precision. This system transformed the relationship between center and province. Instead of loosely allied cities, the new order imposed a rigid hierarchy. Provinces were assigned quotas and obligations, expected to supply the capital with goods and manpower according to a rotating schedule. This arrangement resembled a massive machine, with each region acting as a gear that turned when commanded. In theory, it ensured fairness and predictability. In practice, it demanded constant compliance regardless of local conditions. Kings presented themselves not just as warriors, but as master administrators. Inscriptions praise rulers who could read, write, and calculate, skills once reserved for scribes. Literacy became a political virtue, signaling control over the mechanisms that had once failed. The king was portrayed as shepherd, judge, builder, and accountant, a figure whose authority flowed from competence as much as divine selection. Religion adapted to this emphasis on order. Rituals continued, but they were increasingly standardized, embedded within bureaucratic routines. Offerings were scheduled, recorded, and audited. Temples functioned as administrative hubs, their sacred role inseparable from economic management. The gods were still powerful, but their worship became more systematized, less dependent on spontaneous devotion, and more on correct procedure. For a time, this approach worked. Cities regained population, canals were repaired, trade routes reopened, monumental construction resumed, including massive ziggurats whose scale conveyed confidence and continuity. Literature flourished, with scribes compiling and copying older works alongside new compositions that praised stability and righteous kingship. The memory of collapse sharpened the desire for control. Yet beneath this surface of order lay familiar vulnerabilities. The centralized system was efficient but brittle. It assumed predictable harvests, obedient provinces, and uninterrupted communication. Any disruption reverberated through the entire structure. A failed crop in one region affected rations elsewhere. A rebellious governor threatened the balance of obligations. The system left little room for improvisation. Environmental pressures had not vanished. Salinization continued to degrade southern soils, forcing increased reliance on barley and reducing nutritional quality. Climate patterns remained unstable, with periods of drought testing irrigation networks stretched thin by overuse. The very efficiency of the system masked these stresses, redistributing shortages until reserves ran dry. Social tension grew alongside administrative control. Farmers burdened with quotas struggled to meet demands, while officials enforced regulations with increasing severity. Tablets record investigations, punishments, and reforms, evidence of a state fighting symptoms rather than causes. Loyalty became transactional, maintained through rations and threat rather than shared identity. External pressures intensified this strain. Nomadic groups moved along the fringes of settled land, sometimes absorbed as laborers or soldiers, sometimes repelled as raiders. Managing these populations required constant vigilance and resources. Defensive walls and frontier forts multiplied, consuming labor that might otherwise sustain agriculture. Security became a permanent expense. Cultural memory played a paradoxical role. The new rulers invoked Sumerian heritage to legitimize their authority, presenting themselves as restorers rather than innovators. Sumerian language, though no longer spoken widely, remained the medium of high culture and ritual. This connection to the past reinforced continuity but also constrained change, binding the present to models forged under different conditions. The bureaucracy's sheer scale created its own momentum. Record-keeping expanded because the system demanded proof of compliance. Tablets multiplied, tracking ever finer details. This documentation offers modern scholars unparalleled insight, but it also reveals how deeply administration penetrated daily life. The state was everywhere, counting, measuring, allocating, and correcting. As long as resources flowed, the machine functioned. When pressures mounted simultaneously, cracks appeared. Provinces delayed deliveries, soldiers demanded higher rations, officials falsified records to avoid punishment. Each small failure required new rules, increasing complexity and reducing flexibility. The lessons of Sumer's collapse were being reenacted in a different form. What distinguished this era was awareness. The rulers knew collapse was possible. Their efforts to prevent it were deliberate and sustained. They believed that through perfect administration, they could overcome the limits that had undone their predecessors. This belief was both strength and weakness, inspiring remarkable organization while discouraging radical adaptation. The revival demonstrated that civilizations can recover from catastrophe, but it also showed that recovery often carries the seeds of future crisis. Systems designed to eliminate uncertainty can become intolerant of variation. Control can suppress symptoms while amplifying underlying stress. The legacy of Sumer informed every decision, even as its warnings were partially misunderstood. In the end, this reassembled world stood not as a simple continuation, but as a testament to humanity's refusal to abandon complexity. The cities rose again, altered but recognizable, carrying forward ideas born millennia earlier. Yet the memory embedded in the clay tablets lingered like a shadow, reminding anyone who could read them that order is always provisional, sustained by balance rather than command alone. The restored order depended on movement that never stopped. Grain moved from field to storehouse, from storehouse to temple, from temple to barracks. Labor moved from village to canal, from canal to wall, from wall to road. Animals moved from pasture to pen, from pen to offering table. Nothing was allowed to remain still for long, because stillness meant loss, spoilage, or resistance. The state survived by keeping everything in circulation, like blood forced through a body already showing signs of fever. This circulation was enforced through obligation rather than choice. Records from the period describe rotating labor systems that pulled workers away from their homes for weeks at a time. Men dug canals in regions far from their families, repaired walls for cities they had never lived in, guarded roads that no longer felt safe. In theory, the burden was shared. In practice, it accumulated unevenly, falling hardest on those with the least influence to resist it. Exhaustion became a social condition, not an exception. The calendar itself was turned into an instrument of pressure. Each year was broken into assigned duties, its seasons no longer guided solely by agriculture, but by administrative demand. When floods or drought disrupted this schedule, the system did not pause. It compensated by extracting more effort from fewer people. Tablets show increased penalties for missed quotas, as if punishment could replace rainfall. The language remains calm and formal, even as the circumstances it describes grow desperate. Communication strained under this load. Messengers traveled longer routes through territories that no longer felt secure. Delays multiplied. Orders arrived too late to be useful. Responses were recorded but not acted upon. The written word, once a tool of clarity, became a buffer between decision and consequence. Authority spoke, but its voice took time to reach the edges, and reality often moved faster than commands etched in clay. Military organization reflected the same tension. Garrisons demanded regular rations to maintain loyalty, but supplying them required convoys vulnerable to attack or theft. Soldiers who went unpaid or unfed turned unreliable, sometimes deserting, sometimes exploiting local populations. Tablets record disciplinary actions and investigations, signs that control was slipping despite constant oversight. The army remained formidable, but its cohesion depended increasingly on force rather than confidence. Religion continued to frame these struggles, but its tone shifted further toward obligation. Ritual precision mattered more than devotion. Offerings were counted, recorded, and audited. Priests followed schedules as strict as any administrators, their work integrated into the machinery of the state. The gods were honored correctly, if not joyfully. Faith became maintenance, a series of tasks performed to prevent disaster rather than invite blessing. Cultural life persisted within these constraints. Scribes copied ancient hymns and epics, preserving language and tradition even as daily speech changed. These texts offered continuity, reminding readers of heroes and kings who had faced chaos before. Yet the emphasis subtly shifted. Stories lingered on endurance rather than triumph, on acceptance rather than conquest. Literature mirrored experience, adapting to a world where survival itself felt heroic. Environmental decline continued its quiet advance. Fields abandoned years earlier did not recover. Canals required constant dredging as silt accumulated faster than labor could remove it. Tablets note repeated reassignment of land, attempts to find productivity where little remained. The system responded by tightening control, reallocating resources with increasing urgency. Each adjustment kept the state functioning while narrowing its margin for error. Social cohesion frayed under this pressure. Communities accustomed to shared ritual and mutual aid found themselves competing for allocations. Trust eroded as records replaced relationships. Disputes increased, documented in legal tablets that reveal a population turning to authority rather than neighbors for resolution. Law expanded as solidarity contracted. External groups sensed opportunity. Nomadic populations pressed closer to settled lands, drawn by remaining resources. Some were absorbed, registered, assigned labor. Others resisted incorporation, remaining mobile and unpredictable. Managing them demanded constant negotiation or force, both expensive in a system already stretched thin. Frontier defenses multiplied, consuming labor that agriculture desperately needed. The paradox of this era lies in its competence. The state functioned impressively given its constraints. It repaired, redistributed, recorded, and responded. Yet each success depended on conditions that were becoming rarer. Predictable seasons, compliant provinces, intact trade routes. When multiple stresses converged, the system could not absorb them without magnifying their impact elsewhere. Administrative records grow denser as conditions worsen, an archive swelling even as capacity shrinks. This accumulation creates the illusion of control, masking the fragility beneath. The more detailed the records become, the clearer it is that they are compensating for uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Writing becomes a substitute for resilience. What emerges from these tablets is not incompetence, but overextension. The rebuilt civilization understood collapse and sought to prevent it through total organization. In doing so, it bound itself to a level of coordination that left little room for adaptation. Stability was achieved through constant effort, not equilibrium. As pressures mounted, endurance replaced ambition. The state no longer expanded confidently, but defended its existing form against erosion. Each year survived felt like a victory, each intact harvest a reprieve. The memory of past collapse infused every decision, encouraging caution that sometimes became paralysis. The clay records preserve this moment of sustained strain, a society holding itself together through procedure and memory. They show a civilization aware of its vulnerability, yet unwilling to relinquish complexity. Order persisted, but it did so under tension that never fully eased, foreshadowing the moment when even this reinforced structure would finally give way. The pressure that had been accumulating for generations finally began to express itself in motion. People moved first, quietly, without ceremony. Families left marginal fields and drifted toward cities that still promised rations, work, or protection. Others moved away from cities whose storehouses echoed hollow. Migration did not appear in the records as a single event, but as absence, as names that stopped recurring on tablets, as labor units that failed to report, as households that dissolved without formal notice. The system recorded what it could count, but movement resisted counting. Urban space changed in response. Neighborhoods closest to temples and administrative centers remained occupied longest, while outer districts emptied. Houses collapsed slowly, roofs caving in under neglect, walls scavenged for brick. The city shrank inward, contracting around its remaining core like a wound closing unevenly. What had once been continuous habitation became islands of activity separated by silence. The administration attempted to manage this contraction with familiar tools. New registers were created to track population. Labor quotas were reassigned. Abandoned land was redistributed to those still willing to farm it. These measures extended the life of the system, but could not reverse its trajectory. Movement continued because the forces driving it were larger than policy. Soil exhaustion, water scarcity, and the exhaustion of trust. As populations shifted, identity shifted with them. People carried language, customs, and memory into new contexts, blending traditions that had once been anchored to specific cities. Sumerian identity, long tied to urban centers and their gods, became more diffuse. It survived in ritual language, legal formulas, and education, but it no longer defined daily belonging. Community became practical rather than symbolic, based on proximity and survival rather than heritage. Political authority struggled to follow this fluidity. Boundaries drawn on tablets meant little to those whose lives now depended on mobility. Governors reported declining control over rural areas. Tax assessments lagged behind reality. The countryside, once the backbone of urban life, became harder to govern as settlements dispersed. Authority thinned with distance, leaving gaps that neither force nor administration could easily fill. Military responses grew harsher as subtle control failed. Garrisons were deployed to secure routes and deter flight. Punishments for non-compliance increased. Tablets record confiscations, forced relocations, and penalties meant to discourage desertion. These actions slowed movement temporarily but deepened resentment, reinforcing the very instability they sought to prevent. Environmental stress intensified this dynamic. Drought cycles shortened recovery periods, leaving little time for fields to regenerate. Rivers shifted courses unpredictably, undermining canal networks that required constant maintenance. Each environmental disruption triggered administrative response, but response lagged behind impact. The landscape changed faster than the system could adapt. Religious interpretation evolved alongside these changes. Laments continued to be copied, but new texts emphasized endurance rather than restoration. The gods were invoked as witnesses rather than saviors, their role reframed as observers of human struggle rather than architects of destiny. This shift did not reject divinity, but tempered expectations. Faith adjusted to a world where divine intervention felt distant. Cultural production persisted, but its scale diminished. Monumental building slowed. Artistic expression became more modest, focusing on personal seals and small objects rather than grand reliefs. These items carried identity in portable form, suitable for a population increasingly on the move. Art adapted to impermanence. Trade networks, already weakened, fragmented further. Local exchange replaced long-distance routes. Markets became regional, reliant on whatever resources could be secured nearby. This localization reduced vulnerability to distant disruptions, but limited access to materials and ideas. Innovation slowed as exchange narrowed. The administrative record from this period grows uneven. Some regions remain well documented, others fade abruptly. This unevenness reflects survival patterns rather than negligence. Where the system endured, writing continued. Where it collapsed, silence followed. The gaps in the record are themselves evidence of uneven decline. Despite these pressures, the civilization did not collapse uniformly. Pockets of stability persisted, sustained by favorable local conditions or effective leadership. These enclaves preserved administrative practice and cultural memory, serving as reservoirs from which later revivals would draw. Collapse was patchwork, not uniform, unfolding differently across space and time. What becomes clear is that decline was not experienced as an ending, but as a series of adjustments. People adapted repeatedly, lowering expectations, altering routines, redefining success. Survival replaced prosperity as the primary goal. The system endured by shrinking, shedding complexity to maintain coherence where possible. The tension between movement and control defines this phase. The state sought to fix people in place, while people sought flexibility in response to changing conditions. Neither side fully prevailed. The result was a landscape marked by partial order, partial abandonment, and constant negotiation. The clay tablets capture this ambiguity. They document authority asserting itself even as its reach contracted. They record compliance and failure side by side, revealing a society in transition rather than collapse. Reading them now, one senses motion beneath stillness, a civilization drifting not into darkness but into transformation. The world that emerged from this process would be different from the one that preceded it, less centralized, less confident, but more adaptive in some respects. The legacy of Sumer continued, carried forward by people rather than cities, by practices rather than monuments. The tablets remain as markers along this path, recording a moment when movement itself became the dominant force shaping history. As movement reshaped the land, memory reshaped authority. In the absence of unquestioned control, legitimacy increasingly depended on narrative rather than force alone. Kings and officials turned to the past, selecting fragments of history that could be arranged into arguments for continuity. Lists of rulers were copied and recopied, smoothing chaos into orderly succession. The act of naming who ruled after whom mattered more than whether those rulers had governed effectively. History became architecture, built to stabilize the present. These king lists did not merely record reigns. They imposed meaning on disruption. Periods of fragmentation were compressed, their instability reduced to brief annotations. Foreign domination was framed as interruption rather than transformation. By structuring time this way, scribes preserved the idea that kingship itself was eternal, even if individual kings were flawed or short-lived. The institution survived on parchment and clay, even when its power wavered in reality. Law played a similar role. Legal traditions continued to be cited, even when enforcement was inconsistent. Contracts referenced older norms, invoking precedents that no longer fit current conditions. This persistence was not stubbornness, but strategy. By anchoring decisions in tradition, communities maintained predictability amid uncertainty. Law became a language of reassurance, a way to claim that rules still applied even as circumstances undermined them. Education reinforced this continuity. Scribal schools remained active where possible, training new generations in languages and texts whose original contexts had faded. Students copied ancient hymns and proverbs, learning values shaped in earlier eras, This curriculum preserved cultural identity, but also distanced learners from present realities. The past was idealized, its complexities simplified into lessons meant to endure. The Sumerian language itself became increasingly symbolic. No longer spoken widely, it functioned as a marker of authority and tradition. Rituals conducted in Sumerian linked the present to an imagined golden age, lending weight to ceremonies even when participants did not fully understand the words they recited. Language became ritual object, valued for its association rather than its utility. Political power during this phase often relied on coalition rather than command. Local leaders negotiated alliances, balancing loyalty to distant authorities with responsiveness to immediate needs. Tablets record agreements, oaths, and guarantees, evidence of a world governed through negotiation as much as decree. Authority was fragmented but adaptive, capable of shifting as conditions demanded. Economic life adjusted accordingly. Large-scale redistribution gave way to mixed systems combining institutional control with local exchange. Temples and palaces still mattered, but households and small networks regained importance. This diversification increased resilience in some areas, allowing communities to survive localized shocks without waiting for central intervention. Religion reflected this decentralization. Local cults gained prominence, emphasizing gods associated with specific places or professions. While major deities remained important, worship became more intimate and practical. People sought protection where they lived and worked, not only from distant cosmic powers. Faith followed population, adapting to new geographies. The physical landscape mirrored these changes. Grand structures deteriorated as maintenance lapsed, while smaller constructions multiplied. Shrines appeared in villages. Storage pits replaced vast granaries. The built environment shifted toward scale and flexibility, reflecting altered priorities. Monumentality gave way to utility. Conflict did not disappear, but changed form. Instead of large campaigns between organized states, violence became more localized and episodic. Raids, skirmishes, and disputes over resources replaced formal warfare. This fragmentation reduced the scale of destruction, but increased its frequency. Security became a daily concern rather than an occasional crisis. The administrative response to this environment was uneven. Some regions maintained records diligently, adapting formats to new realities. Others abandoned formal documentation altogether, relying on oral agreements and customary practice. This diversity complicates modern interpretation, but reflects lived experience. Uniformity was no longer possible or desirable. Despite decline, innovation continued. People experimented with crops, tools, and settlement patterns. These changes rarely appear explicitly in texts, but archaeological evidence suggests adaptation rather than stagnation. Survival demanded creativity, and communities responded with practical solutions grounded in local knowledge. Cultural expression adapted as well. Music, storytelling, and ritual persisted in informal settings, even as official patronage waned. These practices sustained identity outside institutional frameworks, ensuring continuity through performance rather than record. Culture lived where writing did not. The contrast between written memory and lived reality grew sharper. Texts preserved ideals of order, while daily life required compromise. This tension did not break society, but reshaped it. People learned to navigate between inherited norms and immediate necessity, balancing reverence with pragmatism. What emerges from this period is not collapse in the dramatic sense, but transformation through negotiation. Power, culture, and belief adjusted incrementally, responding to pressures without yielding entirely. The world that followed Sumer was not lesser, only different, shaped by lessons learned through loss. The clay tablets remain as witnesses to this process. They show how societies remember in order to endure, how authority adapts when command fails, and how identity survives by changing form. Through them, the past speaks not of finality, but of persistence, reminding us that even in decline, civilizations find ways to carry themselves forward. Time did not heal the fractures, it redistributed them. As generations passed, the memory of collapse settled into habit, shaping expectations rather than inspiring alarm. Children grew up in a world where the great cities were stories rather than lived experience, where broken walls were part of the landscape like riverbanks and reeds. What had once been emergency became normal, and normality reshaped ambition. The horizon of possibility narrowed, not because people lacked imagination, but because survival had taught restraint. New centers of power emerged quietly. They did not announce themselves with sweeping conquest or monumental declarations. Instead, they accumulated influence through reliability. A ruler who could ensure regular rations, protect a trade route, or maintain a canal earned loyalty more effectively than one who claimed divine destiny. Authority became practical, grounded in results rather than grandeur. This shift did not reject tradition, but reinterpreted it, emphasizing competence as a form of legitimacy. Writing adapted to this pragmatic outlook. Administrative texts became shorter, more focused on immediate concerns. Grand proclamations diminished, replaced by records of deliveries, repairs, and agreements. The language remained formal, but its scope contracted. Writing no longer aspired to encompass the world. It aimed to keep a portion of it functioning. The medium that once supported empire adjusted to support continuity at smaller scales. Religion followed a similar path. Large state rituals persisted where resources allowed, but personal devotion grew more prominent. People carried amulets, invoked household gods, and sought protection through everyday practices. Faith became embedded in routine rather than spectacle. The gods were still powerful, but their influence was felt through intimate channels rather than grand intervention. This localization of belief paralleled economic change. Exchange networks stabilized regionally, connecting nearby settlements in webs of mutual dependence. These networks were less impressive than earlier trade routes, but more resilient. When one node failed, others adapted. The economy diversified, relying on mixed agriculture, herding, and craft production rather than centralized redistribution alone. Social structures adjusted to support this resilience. Extended families regained prominence as units of production and security. Kinship networks compensated for weakened institutions, providing support during shortages and conflict. Obligation flowed horizontally as much as vertically, redistributing risk among relatives rather than concentrating it in the state. Conflict, when it arose, was often mediated through negotiation rather than force. Leaders preferred compromise to prolonged violence that could destabilize fragile systems. Agreements were recorded where possible, but enforcement relied heavily on reputation and mutual interest. Trust became a valuable currency, earned slowly and lost quickly. Environmental conditions continued to influence these developments. Some regions recovered partially as populations shifted away from degraded land, allowing limited regeneration. Others remained marginal, their abandonment permanent. People learned to read the land more cautiously, avoiding overextension where previous generations had pushed too far. This ecological awareness, born of necessity, informed settlement choices and agricultural practices. Cultural memory remained selective. The grandeur of early Sumer was remembered, but its excesses were often glossed over. Stories emphasized wisdom gained through suffering rather than ambition punished by collapse. The past was framed as lesson rather than ideal, guiding behavior without demanding replication. Education reflected this reframing. Scribal training continued, but its purpose shifted toward maintaining continuity rather than enabling expansion. Students learned how to preserve records, resolve disputes, and manage resources, skills essential for stability. The heroic narratives of conquest receded, replaced by texts emphasizing justice, balance, and moderation. Political ambition persisted, but it was tempered. Leaders sought to expand influence cautiously, aware that overreach invited disaster. This caution slowed innovation at times, but prevented catastrophic failure. The memory of collapse acted as a brake on reckless consolidation, shaping a political culture that valued endurance over dominance. Over time, these adaptations coalesced into new forms of order. They lacked the dramatic coherence of earlier empires, but compensated with flexibility. Power was distributed across multiple centers, reducing vulnerability to single points of failure. The system functioned not because it was perfectly designed, but because it could bend. The archaeological record from this phase reveals continuity through change. Pottery styles evolve gradually. Settlement patterns shift, but do not disappear. Writing persists unevenly, reflecting varying degrees of institutional support. Together, these traces depict a society that has absorbed shock and adjusted its structure accordingly. What is striking is the absence of overt despair. The laments of earlier periods give way to quieter endurance. Loss is acknowledged, but it no longer dominates expression. People focused on what could be sustained rather than what had been lost. This psychological adjustment was as important as any material change, enabling communities to function without constant reference to catastrophe. The world that emerged was not the one Sumer had imagined at its height, but it was viable. It supported life, culture, and memory under altered conditions. The legacy of the first civilization endured, not as a blueprint to be followed exactly, but as a foundation upon which adaptation was built. In this sense, the story does not end with collapse or revival, but with transformation. The forces that undid Sumer reshaped its descendants, teaching restraint, flexibility, and the value of local knowledge. The clay tablets, silent witnesses to these shifts, preserve not only the record of what was lost, but the evidence of how humanity learned to continue afterward. As generations adjusted to reduced horizons, a subtle shift occurred in how power imagined itself. Authority no longer claimed inevitability, it argued for necessity. Rulers framed their commands as responses to circumstance rather than expressions of destiny. This rhetorical change mattered because it aligned leadership with lived experience. People who had survived collapse were less persuaded by claims of divine right alone. They responded instead to leaders who appeared to understand limits. This new posture reshaped political language. Inscriptions grew less triumphal and more instructional, emphasizing restoration, protection, and balance. Kings described themselves as builders of canals rather than conquerors of lands, as judges who settled disputes rather than warriors who crushed enemies. Violence did not disappear, but it was justified as defense rather than expansion. The tone reflected a society wary of excess. Administrative systems followed suit, prioritizing maintenance over growth. Records focused on keeping existing infrastructure functional rather than extending it. Repair lists replaced construction boasts. The state measured success in continuity. Canals still flowing, granaries still stocked, roads still passable. This emphasis did not eliminate risk, but it moderated ambition. Law codes from later periods echo this pragmatism. They stress compensation over punishment, restoration over retribution. These legal priorities reflect an environment where preserving relationships mattered more than asserting dominance. Social cohesion became a strategic asset, cultivated deliberately to withstand ongoing uncertainty. Religious expression mirrored this ethical shift. Hymns praised gods who maintained order rather than those who bestowed victory. Rituals emphasized regularity and care, reinforcing the idea that stability emerged from attention rather than spectacle. The divine was invoked as a sustaining presence, not a dramatic intervener. Material culture adapted to this mindset. Architecture favored durability and repairability over grandeur. Buildings were designed to be modified as needs changed, reflecting an acceptance of impermanence. Tools were made for longevity, often reused and adapted rather than discarded. The aesthetic of abundance gave way to one of sufficiency. Education reinforced these values. Scribal texts emphasized correct procedure, ethical conduct, and awareness of consequence. Students learned proverbs warning against pride and haste, lessons drawn from collective memory. Wisdom literature gained prominence, offering guidance for navigating complexity without relying on force. Trade, though limited compared to earlier eras, regained importance as a stabilizing factor. Merchants connected regions with complementary resources, creating interdependence that discouraged conflict. These networks were fragile but valuable, incentivizing cooperation. Commerce became diplomacy by other means. Environmental awareness deepened through experience. Farmers adjusted planting strategies, diversified crops, and adopted practices that reduced risk. These adaptations were incremental, shaped by observation rather than theory. Knowledge passed orally alongside written records, embedding ecological understanding in daily practice. Social identity continued to evolve. Communities defined themselves less by city affiliation and more by shared practice and belief. Mobility blurred old boundaries, creating hybrid cultures that combined traditions. This fluidity reduced the rigidity that had once made systems brittle. Conflict, when it arose, was often contained. Leaders sought mediation, aware that prolonged violence could unravel hard-won stability. The cost of war was weighed carefully against potential gain. This caution did not prevent all clashes, but it limited their scale. The memory of earlier collapse persisted as a cautionary backdrop. It informed decision-making even when not explicitly referenced. Leaders who ignored this memory risked losing credibility. The past functioned as an implicit advisor, shaping norms and expectations. What emerges from this period is a civilization recalibrated rather than diminished. It operated at a different scale, with adjusted priorities. Complexity remained, but it was managed with greater humility. The grand experiment of early urbanism had been tempered by experience. The clay tablets from this era reflect this maturity. They are quieter, less dramatic, but deeply instructive. They show how societies can absorb shock and reorient values without abandoning structure altogether. Order becomes something maintained through care rather than imposed through force. This phase does not offer spectacle, but it offers insight. It demonstrates that survival after collapse is not simply about rebuilding what was lost, but about redefining what is worth sustaining. The descendants of Sumer did not replicate their ancestors' achievements exactly. They learned from them, adapting legacy to reality. In doing so, they ensured continuity where total restoration was impossible. Civilization persisted, altered but recognizable, carried forward by practices refined through hardship. The tablets stand as testament to this quieter resilience, preserving evidence that endurance itself can be a form of wisdom. Stability, once regained, never returned in the same shape. It spread unevenly, settling where conditions allowed and dissolving where they did not. Some regions prospered quietly, rebuilding local prosperity through careful management and cooperative networks. Others lingered in marginal existence, sustained by minimal production and fragile peace. This unevenness became a defining feature of the post-collapse world, replacing the earlier expectation that civilization advanced as a single, unified organism. In places where water systems could still be maintained, agriculture recovered modestly. Farmers refined irrigation practices, reducing waste and prioritizing resilience over maximum yield. Crop diversity increased slightly, not as innovation for its own sake, but as insurance against failure. These changes rarely appear explicitly in written records, but they shaped daily life profoundly, grounding survival in accumulated observation rather than centralized planning. Urban centers adapted accordingly. Cities remained important but functioned differently, acting as hubs for exchange, ritual, and administration rather than engines of expansion. Their populations stabilized at lower densities, reducing strain on resources. Public spaces were repurposed, with abandoned districts transformed into gardens, storage areas, or left to decay without urgency. The city learned to coexist with emptiness. Political authority in this context became relational rather than absolute. Leaders depended on cooperation from local elites, religious figures, and community heads. Power flowed through networks of obligation and trust rather than direct command. Decisions were negotiated, compromises accepted. This approach slowed action but increased buy-in, creating systems that could adapt when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. Religion continued to anchor these networks. Local temples served as centers of both worship and coordination, mediating disputes and organizing communal labor. The gods were seen as custodians of balance rather than arbiters of conquest. Ritual calendars emphasized seasonal rhythms and communal maintenance, reinforcing connection to land and cycle rather than destiny and triumph. Writing persisted as a tool of continuity, though its audience narrowed. Documents recorded agreements, inheritances, and obligations critical to local stability. Literary production continued selectively, preserving texts deemed essential to identity and instruction. The act of copying became an assertion of survival, a declaration that knowledge still mattered even when circumstances limited its spread. Cultural exchange did not cease. It transformed. Ideas traveled through migration, intermarriage, and trade rather than formal diplomacy. Languages blended, practices merged. Identity became layered, flexible enough to accommodate change without dissolving entirely. This hybridity reduced the intensity of conflict rooted in rigid boundaries, allowing coexistence where domination had failed. Economic life reflected this pragmatism. Markets adjusted to local conditions, emphasizing barter and small-scale trade. Standardized measures remained useful, but were applied flexibly. Wealth disparities persisted, but were moderated by shared vulnerability. Accumulation beyond immediate need became less visible, constrained by social expectation as much as material limit. Conflict, when unavoidable, tended to be brief and contained. Leaders recognized that prolonged violence endangered everyone. Mechanisms for mediation expanded, drawing on custom and shared interest. These arrangements were imperfect, but effective enough to prevent widespread collapse. Peace was maintained not through overwhelming force, but through mutual exhaustion and learned caution. Environmental change continued to exert pressure, but communities responded with experience-honed strategies. Settlement patterns shifted subtly, favoring areas with sustainable water access. Marginal lands were used seasonally or abandoned entirely. This retreat from overextension marked a significant departure from earlier attitudes that had pushed cultivation to its limits. Memory played a complex role in shaping these adaptations. The collapse of earlier urban systems was remembered not as a single catastrophe, but as a gradual unraveling. This understanding fostered patience. People accepted that change could be slow and that recovery did not follow a straight path. Expectation adjusted to reality. Educational practices reflected this tempered outlook. Instruction emphasized mastery of essentials rather than breadth. Students learned how to maintain records, interpret law, and manage resources within constrained environments. Knowledge was transmitted with an awareness of its application, linking learning directly to survival and stability. Art and expression adapted to these conditions. Grand monuments were rare, but craftsmanship endured in smaller forms. Personal objects carried symbolic meaning, reinforcing identity and continuity. Creativity persisted as affirmation rather than display, sustaining morale and cohesion. Over time, these localized systems formed a mosaic of societies connected by shared heritage, but distinguished by circumstance. The idea of a single, dominant center faded, replaced by a landscape of interdependent regions. This pluralism reduced systemic risk, distributing power and responsibility across multiple nodes. The clay tablets from this era, sparse yet telling, capture moments of agreement, repair, and adaptation. They lack the drama of conquest or collapse, but their quiet persistence speaks volumes. They show a civilization learning to live within limits, adjusting ambition to environment, and valuing continuity over dominance. This phase of history does not offer spectacle, but it offers durability. It demonstrates how societies absorb lessons through experience, reshaping values and structures accordingly. The descendants of Sumer did not abandon civilization. They recalibrated it. Through this recalibration, they preserved essential practices, writing, law, ritual, cooperation, while shedding assumptions that had proven dangerous. The world they inhabited was less grand, but more sustainable, shaped by humility forged in hardship. The record left behind affirms that endurance often emerges not from boldness, but from restraint. Civilization, once broken, did not simply rebuild upward. It spread outward, downward, and inward, finding forms capable of lasting where earlier designs had failed. The longer a society survives after disaster, the more subtly that disaster reshapes its instincts. What had once been remembered as trauma slowly transformed into habit, guiding behavior without conscious reference. Communities no longer spoke constantly of collapse, yet their decisions revealed its imprint. Fields were not pushed to their limits. Storehouses were kept fuller than necessary. Alliances were favored over domination. These patterns were not written as law, but lived as custom, passed through practice rather than decree. Leadership in this environment evolved accordingly. Authority rested less on spectacle and more on predictability. A ruler who kept water flowing, disputes contained, and obligations fair inspired confidence that conquest never could. Power expressed itself through continuity. The absence of crisis became the highest achievement, even if it rarely earned praise. Kingship, once defined by heroic excess, became associated with restraint and attentiveness. Administrative practices reflected this change. Records emphasized balance rather than accumulation. Deliveries were tracked not to maximize extraction, but to avoid imbalance. Officials intervened earlier when shortages appeared, preventing local stress from spreading. This vigilance required constant attention, but it reduced the likelihood of cascading failure. The system learned to act before breaking points were reached. Writing regained a central role in maintaining this equilibrium. Tablets recorded agreements, shared responsibilities, and boundary conditions. The tone of documentation shifted toward cooperation. Correspondence reveals negotiation and compromise, evidence of authority functioning through dialogue rather than imposition. The written word became a medium for coordination rather than command. Religion continued to anchor these practices, offering a framework that reinforced moderation. Rituals emphasized harmony between human activity and natural cycles. The gods were portrayed as guardians of balance, displeased by excess and neglect alike. Worship reinforced values already embedded in daily life, aligning belief with practice. Economic activity expanded cautiously within these constraints. Artisans produced goods for regional exchange, stimulating local prosperity without dependence on distant networks. Surplus was modest but meaningful, supporting specialization while preserving resilience. Markets operated as spaces of connection rather than engines of growth, sustaining social bonds alongside commerce. Social organization strengthened around mutual reliance. Cooperative labor arrangements spread, sharing risk among participants. Communities pooled resources to buffer against seasonal variability. These practices reduced individual vulnerability and fostered collective responsibility. Obligation flowed through networks rather than hierarchies, creating flexibility in response to change. Environmental management benefited from accumulated experience. Farmers adjusted irrigation schedules, monitored soil condition, and rotated land use to preserve fertility. These practices evolved through observation rather than innovation, refining existing methods rather than introducing radical change. The land was treated as a partner, requiring care, rather than a resource to be exhausted. Conflict persisted, but was constrained by shared understanding of cost. Leaders avoided prolonged warfare, preferring negotiated settlements when possible. Violence, when unavoidable, was limited in scope and duration. This restraint reflected collective memory of instability, reinforcing norms that valued preservation over victory. Cultural expression mirrored this ethos. Stories celebrated cleverness, patience, and cooperation. Heroes succeeded through foresight rather than force. Artistic forms favored durability and symbolism over grandeur. These expressions reinforced identity while discouraging excess. Education adapted to support this worldview. Instruction emphasized practical skills, ethical conduct, and awareness of consequence. Students learned not only how systems functioned, but why they required care. Knowledge transmission focused on maintaining continuity rather than achieving novelty. As these patterns stabilized, regional diversity flourished. Communities developed distinctive adaptations suited to local conditions. This diversity enhanced resilience, preventing uniform failure. Exchange between regions spread ideas without imposing uniformity, allowing experimentation within bounds. The political landscape that emerged was decentralized yet interconnected. Multiple centers of influence coexisted, linked by agreements and shared norms. Authority shifted gradually through consensus rather than abrupt overthrow. This fluidity allowed adaptation without destabilization. Material evidence from this period supports this picture. Settlements show steady maintenance rather than rapid expansion. Tools and buildings reflect reuse and repair. These traces suggest confidence tempered by caution, a society comfortable operating within learned limits. Memory continued to guide behavior quietly. Stories of earlier collapse persisted in education and ritual, serving as reminders rather than warnings. They informed choices without dominating imagination. The past became a reference point, not a blueprint. Over time, this equilibrium enabled broader coordination. Regions that had stabilized locally began to align interests, forming larger networks of cooperation. Integration proceeded slowly, shaped by experience rather than ambition. Growth resumed, but it was incremental and measured. The strength of this world lay in its adaptability. Systems were designed to bend rather than resist change. Authority functioned through service. Stability emerged from care rather than control. Civilization endured by redefining success. The tablets from this era reflect this maturity. They record maintenance, agreement, and shared responsibility. Their consistency testifies to a society that learned to live with uncertainty rather than deny it. This phase demonstrates that endurance is not the absence of failure, but the ability to learn from it. The descendants of Sumer did not restore what was lost. They created something different, shaped by memory and restraint, capable of lasting where earlier forms could not. The slow return of confidence did not erase vulnerability. It concealed it beneath routine. As systems stabilized, their very familiarity dulled awareness of how delicately they were balanced. Daily life settled into patterns that felt reliable, and reliability bred assumption. Fields were planted because they had been planted before. Agreements were honored because they usually were. The absence of catastrophe became evidence that catastrophe was unlikely, even though the conditions that once produced it had never fully disappeared. This subtle shift altered how risk was perceived. Where earlier generations had acted cautiously, Later ones began to test limits again, not recklessly but incrementally. Additional land was brought under cultivation. Trade routes extended a little farther. Administrative reach expanded slightly beyond proven capacity. Each extension seemed justified, supported by recent success. The system absorbed these changes without immediate failure, reinforcing confidence. Political leaders responded to this mood by widening their ambitions carefully. They framed expansion as consolidation, improvement rather than growth. New obligations were introduced gradually, presented as minor adjustments rather than structural change. Authority expanded by normalization, integrating new demands into existing routines until they felt inevitable. Writing reflects this shift in tone. Records grow denser again, tracking broader networks of exchange and obligation. Correspondence discusses planning beyond immediate maintenance, hinting at renewed strategic thinking. The language remains measured, but its scope widens, signaling a society willing to imagine more than survival. Religion accommodated this expansion subtly. Rituals incorporated prayers for prosperity alongside those for balance. The gods were asked not only to preserve, but to bless growth. This theological adjustment mirrored changing expectations, legitimizing cautious ambition without abandoning restraint. Faith adapted to possibility. Economic life responded with increased specialization. Crafts diversified. Trade intensified regionally, supporting modest surplus accumulation. Markets grew busier, their activity signaling confidence. These developments improved living standards for some, though disparities widened quietly. Inequality re-emerged, not dramatically, but enough to shape social dynamics. Social organization absorbed these changes unevenly. Cooperative networks persisted, but competition intensified at their edges. Some families accumulated resources and influence, leveraging stability to advance. Others remained vulnerable, dependent on shared systems that now carried additional strain. The balance between mutual support and individual advancement grew more delicate. Environmental pressure remained constant beneath this activity. Soils continued to bear the scars of earlier exploitation. Water systems required relentless maintenance. Each new extension increased demand on these foundations. The system compensated through efficiency and experience, but margins narrowed. Flexibility diminished as complexity returned. Conflict patterns reflected these tensions. Disputes over resources became more frequent, though still constrained. Leaders mediated aggressively, aware that escalation threatened hard-won stability. Force was applied selectively, reinforcing authority without provoking widespread resistance. Peace endured, but it demanded constant attention. Cultural expression captured this ambivalence. Stories celebrated ingenuity and ambition tempered by wisdom. Heroes succeeded by navigating complexity rather than transcending it. Art balanced themes of growth and caution, reflecting a society negotiating its relationship with possibility. Education expanded alongside these developments. Training emphasized administrative competence and strategic thinking, preparing individuals to manage larger systems. Historical instruction highlighted past collapses as lessons, reinforcing the need for vigilance. Knowledge served as both enabler and restraint. As regional networks grew denser, integration increased. Coordination across broader areas became feasible, supported by shared practices and memory. This integration promised efficiency and security, but it also reintroduced systemic risk. Interdependence amplified the impact of disruption. The political landscape shifted accordingly. Authority consolidated gradually, aligning regions under shared frameworks. This consolidation avoided dramatic conquest, relying instead on alignment of interest. It appeared stable, grounded in mutual benefit. Yet beneath this stability lay renewed complexity, carrying familiar vulnerabilities. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests cautious prosperity. Construction activity increases modestly. Material quality improves. Settlements expand slightly. These signs point to confidence without extravagance, growth without hubris. Yet they also signal rising demand on resources already strained. The memory of collapse remained present but softened by time. It functioned more as cultural backdrop than active warning. People remembered that disaster was possible, but recent experience suggested it was manageable. This perception encouraged experimentation within bounds, reshaping ambition. The critical tension of this phase lies here. Stability invited complexity. Complexity reduced flexibility. The system approached thresholds incrementally, without clear markers of danger. Each step felt safe, because the previous one had been. Risk accumulated quietly, distributed across networks that masked its concentration. The clay tablets from this era capture this layered reality. They record growth intertwined with caution, planning alongside maintenance. They show a society confident enough to expand, yet mindful enough to document. Their detail reflects both achievement and vulnerability. This phase demonstrates how recovery can circle back toward conditions that once produced collapse, not through ignorance, but through success. Adaptation breeds stability. Stability invites ambition. Ambition restores complexity. The cycle does not repeat exactly, but its shape echoes. The descendants of Sumer did not forget the past. They lived with it, even as distance softened its urgency. Their world balanced on experience and hope, pushing forward carefully. The system endured, but its renewed intricacy carried familiar tension, setting the stage for challenges that would test whether lessons learned could still hold. The renewed complexity did not announce itself as danger. It arrived as opportunity. Expanded trade meant fuller markets. Larger administrative networks meant smoother coordination. Consolidated authority promised security. Each benefit reinforced the belief that the system had finally learned how to grow without breaking. Yet beneath these visible gains, the foundations bore increasing load, and the balance between resilience and efficiency grew more precarious with every adjustment. Administration once again became the primary instrument through which order was maintained. Records multiplied, tracking obligations across wider territories. What had been local coordination evolved into regional oversight. Decisions traveled farther from the circumstances they governed, relying on abstraction to replace familiarity. This distance introduced subtle delays and distortions, not immediately catastrophic, but cumulative. Political leadership adapted to this scale by emphasizing continuity and legitimacy. Rulers presented themselves as guardians of inherited wisdom, invoking tradition to justify expanded authority. Their power rested less on fear than on the promise of stability, a promise supported by recent experience. The system worked well enough to discourage dissent, even as it narrowed alternatives. Religion continued to validate this structure. Temples integrated seamlessly into administrative frameworks, their rituals aligned with state calendars and obligations. Divine favor was associated with orderly expansion, reinforcing the sense that growth itself was sanctioned. Faith and governance moved in parallel, each lending weight to the other. Economic life reflected this alignment. Surplus increased modestly, supporting larger institutions and specialized labor. Crafts and trade flourished within regulated channels, their success dependent on maintained infrastructure and predictable demand. Prosperity appeared sustainable, though unevenly distributed. Wealth concentrated quietly, reshaping social dynamics without provoking immediate crisis. Social cohesion adjusted under this pressure. Cooperative networks persisted, but hierarchy sharpened. Access to resources increasingly depended on position within administrative systems. Those embedded in these structures thrived. Those at their margins became more vulnerable. Inequality widened incrementally, often justified as functional differentiation rather than injustice. Environmental constraints remained unchanged. Water systems required constant care. Soils tolerated limited exploitation. Each expansion drew closer to thresholds established long ago. Experience mitigated risk, but could not eliminate it. The land absorbed pressure until it could not, its limits indifferent to administrative precision. Conflict patterns shifted accordingly. Competition intensified where resources tightened, though overt violence remained contained. Disputes were mediated through institutions designed to preserve stability. These mechanisms worked, but they depended on continuous authority. Any lapse threatened escalation, increasing reliance on centralized control. Cultural expression captured this tension subtly. Stories and proverbs emphasized balance, warning against excess even as ambition resurfaced. Art reflected order and continuity rather than innovation, reinforcing established norms. Creativity served cohesion more than challenge. Education expanded to support the growing system. Training emphasized administrative competence, legal knowledge, and coordination across distance. Students learned to think in abstractions, managing resources they might never see directly. This perspective enabled scale but reduced sensitivity to local nuance. As integration deepened, interdependence increased. Regions relied on one another more heavily, amplifying the impact of disruption. A failed harvest or delayed delivery resonated across networks. The system compensated through redistribution, but each intervention drew on finite reserves. The memory of past collapse lingered, but it was increasingly interpreted as proof of resilience rather than warning. The fact that society had recovered encouraged confidence that it could adapt again if necessary. This belief reduced urgency, encouraging incremental risk-taking within familiar frameworks. Material evidence from this period suggests cautious prosperity approaching saturation. Infrastructure shows signs of heavy use. Maintenance continues, but strains appear. Settlements stabilize at higher density. These indicators point to a system operating near capacity. The critical challenge lay not in ignorance, but in success. The system functioned well enough to obscure its fragility. Complexity masked risk by distributing it, delaying feedback until stress accumulated. By the time strain became visible, options narrowed. The clay tablets from this era document a society managing abundance with discipline, yet their detail also reveals mounting obligation. Each record adds weight to a structure already burdened by expectation. The archive grows even as flexibility diminishes. This phase illustrates how civilizations approach limits not through sudden error, but through gradual optimization. Each improvement removes slack. Each efficiency reduces tolerance for disruption. Stability becomes dependent on constant precision. The descendants of Sumer stood once more at a threshold, not of collapse yet, but of renewed vulnerability. Their world balanced achievement and exposure, sustained by memory but propelled by ambition. The question was no longer whether they remembered past failure, but whether memory alone could counter the pressures of success. The system endured, but its margins thinned. The patterns set in motion during this phase would determine whether adaptation remained possible or whether accumulated strain would once again demand reckoning. The tablets, silent but meticulous, preserve the moment when confidence and risk became indistinguishable. The final reckoning did not arrive as a singular disaster, but as a convergence so familiar that few recognized it as decisive. Systems continued to function, rituals were observed, records were kept, and authority issued commands that were largely obeyed. What changed was the margin for recovery. When strain appeared, the responses that had once worked now merely postponed consequence. The world had become efficient enough to survive shock, but not resilient enough to absorb it indefinitely. Environmental limits asserted themselves without ceremony. Water arrived later in the season, or not at all. Canals required more labor than could be spared. Fields produced less despite careful management. Each shortfall was compensated through redistribution, drawing down reserves accumulated over years of cautious prosperity. This strategy succeeded until it did not. When reserves thinned, redistribution amplified scarcity rather than alleviating it. Administrative precision, once a strength, became a liability. The system required accurate input to function, but accuracy depended on conditions no longer reliable. Delays cascaded through networks. A missed delivery in one region disrupted schedules elsewhere. Officials corrected discrepancies by reallocating burden, increasing pressure on communities already stretched thin. Compliance persisted, but morale eroded quietly. Political authority responded with reaffirmation. Rulers emphasized continuity, invoking tradition and stability to reinforce legitimacy. These appeals resonated less than before. People complied out of habit rather than conviction, their trust sustained by lack of alternatives rather than belief. Authority remained visible, but its emotional foundation weakened. Religion continued to frame experience, but its tone shifted again. Rituals sought protection rather than prosperity. Prayers emphasized endurance, asking the gods to preserve what remained rather than grant increase. Faith adapted to contraction, offering solace where explanation failed. The divine was no longer expected to restore balance, only to witness perseverance. Economic activity contracted in response. Trade routes shortened. Specialization receded as households diversified production to reduce dependence. Markets thinned, their activity reflecting necessity rather than opportunity. These adjustments improved local resilience, but weakened larger networks, reducing the system's ability to coordinate responses across distance. Social cohesion frayed unevenly. Cooperative practices endured in some communities, strengthened by shared hardship. Elsewhere, competition intensified as resources dwindled. Inequality sharpened not through accumulation, but through differential access to stability. Those embedded in administrative structures retained relative security. Others slipped toward precarity. Conflict, long contained, became more volatile. Disputes over water and land escalated faster, mediation strained by urgency. Leaders intervened selectively, prioritizing stability in core regions over periphery. This triage preserved centers at the expense of margins, accelerating fragmentation. Cultural expression reflected this narrowing focus. Stories emphasized loss and endurance, revisiting themes familiar from earlier laments. The tone was not apocalyptic but weary, acknowledging limits without surprise. Memory resurfaced not as warning but as recognition, a sense of having arrived where ancestors once stood. Education contracted alongside opportunity. Training focused on essential skills, abandoning broader curricula. Knowledge transmission persisted where institutions survived, but its reach diminished. Learning became practical and localized, oriented toward immediate voids rather than systemic coordination. As pressures converged, the system's interconnectedness magnified impact. What had once been an asset now transmitted stress rapidly. Local failures resonated across networks, overwhelming corrective mechanisms. Authority responded with consolidation, but consolidation increased dependency, narrowing options further. The final stage was marked by selective abandonment. Peripheral regions were deprioritized, their maintenance deemed unsustainable. Populations migrated inward or outward, seeking conditions that allowed survival. Cities contracted once more, repeating patterns recorded generations earlier. The cycle did not repeat exactly, but its contours were unmistakable. The clay tablets from this period grow sparse, their silence as telling as earlier abundance. Where writing continued, it recorded contraction rather than collapse, reduced rations, reassigned obligations, simplified structures. Where it ceased, life persisted without record, adapting beyond administrative reach. What ended was not civilization itself, but a particular configuration of complexity. The systems that had once balanced ambition and restraint finally exceeded their capacity. This outcome was not failure of knowledge or memory, but of cumulative constraint. Experience guided adaptation, but it could not erase limits. The legacy of Sumer and its successors lies here. They demonstrated humanity's capacity to build, recover, adapt, and endure across centuries of challenge. They also revealed the cost of complexity when margins vanish. Their history is not a morality tale, but a record of interaction between ambition, environment, and organization. In the end, people continued. They carried practices, beliefs, and memories forward into new contexts. Writing survived in altered forms. Law persisted. Ritual adapted. Civilization did not disappear. It transformed again, shedding structures that could no longer be sustained. The tablets remain as anchors in this long process, preserving moments of clarity amid uncertainty. They do not offer resolution, only continuity. Through them, the past speaks not of triumph or defeat, but of persistence shaped by limits. This is the enduring lesson carried from the first cities to those that followed. Stability is provisional. Recovery is not restoration. Memory guides but does not guarantee. Civilization survives not by denying fragility, but by living within it, again and again, as each generation inherits both the achievements and the constraints left behind.